This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for April 3rd, 2018, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi everyone.
We all hope you had a great, wonderful long weekend, if you celebrate such a holiday. And we have a great show for you tonight. I am going to talk to you about Jordan Peterson and his book, 12 Rules for Life. Ooh. Cristina is going to explore whether Lebron James gained 7 pounds during a basketball game.
Good boy.
But first, Adam, is there a war on Easter from Cadbury?
That's a great question, Darren. Last weekend was Easter for those of us who observe the newfangled Gregorian calendar. A time to celebrate the death and rebirth of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for some of us, but a time for a religious jihad on Christians for private companies like Cadbury, who would like nothing more than to see an end to this highly profitable holiday.
Dun dun dun.
A religious jihad, no less.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds serious.
The secular jihad is something to be wary of, but
Yeah, it's lowercase j. Now, in the days leading up to Easter this year, I got a whiff of something interesting on social media. The post in question, which has gone viral with some 15,000 retweets and 50,000 likes, read as follows, and I quote, "At this time of the year, please spare a thought for the Cadbury social media team." This includes a few screenshots from the UK-based Cadbury account responding to some posts. And I quote here, "Peter Starbucks said, at Cadbury UK, hello, I don't understand why you are happy to promote by TV the Easter hunt but seem to have dropped Easter from your eggs. Isn't that hypocritical?" Response, "We haven't. We've used the word Easter in marketing and comms for over 100 years and continue to do so in our 2018 Easter range. We often update packaging to ensure we keep things exciting. This year, we've had a spring season makeover and the word Easter is displayed more prominently." Smiley face emoticon. A couple more. Montana said, "Why have you surrendered to faceless liberals and removed the word Easter from the egg? Won't be buying any this year. What's next? A selection box with Christmas remove?"
Faceless liberals. When you take it literally, it sounds really weird.
It gives a creepy mental image. Cadbury's response was, word for word, exactly identical to their other one. "We haven't, blah, blah, blah." John Fahey says, at Cadbury UK, "I hear you've eliminated the word Easter from your Easter eggs. Bye-bye, Cadbury." Again, the exact same response. But I wondered what the full story behind this was, and with it being Easter, my investigation sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole. Okay, it wasn't much of a rabbit hole, but that was too much to pass. I quickly found that the source of what many are calling a misconception came from a March 2016 Daily Star article, "Chocolate Makers Ban Easter from Eggs to Stop Offending Other Religions." The article goes on to claim, who else but political correctness for prompting Cadbury to remove the word Easter from their egg hunt pack. Now, this was in 2016. Last year, in 2017, Theresa May, the Prime Minister of England, commented on the issue after it was claimed that Cadbury dropped the word Easter from the National Trust Easter egg hunt. And I quote, "I think the stance they have taken is absolutely ridiculous. I don't know what they're thinking about, frankly. Easter's very important. It's important to me. It's a very important festival for the Christian faith for millions across the country. So I think what the National Trust is doing is frankly just ridiculous." Now, this was well publicized, which only fueled the outrage which continued into this year, as Cadbury UK's social media campaign is well aware. So what's going on here? Is this, as they say, fake news? Has the word really been avoided, or, as Cadbury claims, is it still being displayed prominently? In a sense, Cadbury is quite correct. The word Easter still appears in a bunch of their Easter products. It is frequently used on their website, which is named easter.cadbury.co.uk, and social media page. More generally, no one really doubts that Cadbury's chocolate eggs are an Easter treat. These are chocolates sold only in the days building up to Easter, and an egg hunt is something which, despite its pagan roots, is almost exclusively celebrated in relation to Easter, be it by Christians or those celebrating the more secular bunny side of Easter. That said, let's look at the specific claim and see if there's anything to it. The product in question, which is the Egg Hunt Pack, can be seen from their 2016 packaging, used to be called the Easter Egg Trail Pack in 2012. So this is a sort of mixed set including various Cadbury Easter products such as mini eggs and other sorts of Cadbury eggs. So while a lot of the outrage doesn't have much merit, the simple fact is that this and many other products used to have the word Easter on them, and they no longer do. The specific reasons for this aren't totally clear. If Cadbury is to be believed, they simply change their packaging all the time. Despite the claim being popularized by the Daily Star article that I mentioned, it was actually originally brought up by a Christian company, the Meaningful Chocolate Company, which markets real Easter eggs, which include Christian symbolism, including crosses on their packaging. So this isn't like we found some upset buyers who were really annoyed at it. This really was an active attempt to sort of curb that. Now, their claim that the word Easter is intentionally removed to avoid from offending non-Christians seems to be unfounded, considering the mere existence of such Cadbury products is because of Easter, and the excessive amount of Easter branding on all Cadbury products and promotions. Really, it wouldn't make sense if they're not trying to offend someone. They're doing a terrible job of it. The war on Easter seems to be a lot like the war on Christmas, in that it's not a real thing. Companies such as Cadbury, like anyone who sells pretty much anything in the months leading up to Christmas, depend on being able to exploit the excessive proliferation of Christian celebrations to maximize their profits. Without Easter, Cadbury would lose massive amounts of business. While it is indeed true that the Egg Hunt Pack, like other Cadbury products, no longer include the word Easter in their name, this does not seem to follow a general trend of avoiding the term by the company. Such claims were actually started by a company which themselves was just looking to cash in on the Easter egg business.
This reminds me of those Starbucks shenanigans, if you guys remember.
Oh, yeah. Every year there's something about the stupid cup or something.
Yeah.
These private companies would love nothing more than for Christmas to go away and for them to just be in the red all year instead of just, 3/4 of the year.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder if consumption patterns would shift to compensate, but maybe they wouldn't.
Maybe, but I think they would have to drastically change their business model because a lot of companies just lose money from January to the end of October pretty much. And to be able to really just make, for a toy company to make money just off of birthdays, it's like half the sales,
Oh, yes. Yeah, you'd have to have some other reason.
Yeah.
If you felt your Easter weekend was filled with chaos and darkness, then you're ready for some Jordan Peterson talk. Jordan Peterson and 12 Rules for Life. Given how staggeringly popular Jordan Peterson has become, and because a listener asked what we thought of him, I thought it was time to provide some coverage. I'll provide my personal context, some general thoughts, and then a short review I did of his recent book. Note, this will not be exhaustive because I could probably spend about an hour talking about Peterson. For some background, I first encountered Peterson 13 years ago when he gave a talk at Dalhousie, a university out east in Canada, and he was the most intense speaker I've ever seen in person. Intelligent and compelling as well. Back in Toronto, I did meet with him and even read a book he never published about self-deception, and I was exploring doing a PhD with him at University of Toronto, but they didn't let me in, so that was the end of that. I've also been thinking about Peterson a lot lately. I've paid attention to numerous articles about him, most of them have poor criticism, exploring his TVO Maps of Meaning lectures twice, as well as this Agenda episode where he talks about gender pronouns, the famous or infamous BBC Channel 4 interview where he was truly masterful, various online discussions, and numerous online videos. Another note, I generally like a lot of his stuff, even though this review may sound critical. That's because, as I said, there aren't that many good critiques out there. That was the personal context. Now, general thoughts before the book review. Peterson has said so many things, so many things. It is important to know which part or parts people have in mind when they discuss him. Are we discussing the endearing uncle who is telling you to get your life together? The compassionate or stern clinical psychologist? The 1950s dad who is complaining about how civilization has lost its way, including gender issues? Or the interpreter of mythology that reveals supposedly deep truths about the nature of being? And I think it's really important you clarify versus someone saying, oh, he's great versus he's terrible. Yeah. Maybe you both agree because you've heard completely different things.
This is great and this is terrible.
Yeah. On the self-help front, some of his videos are great. He manages to insult you while being endearing. There was one talking about procrastination, and he says, you're trying to do the thing, and you can't even get yourself to do these basic tasks. You're a terrible, terrible employee, but you're a worse boss. You should fire yourself, but you won't, will you? And it's funny. And you watch, you're like, that makes sense. And he gives you some practical tips. Like, what's the problem there? He's going to help you improve your life. As well, Peterson's performance in that interview on BBC Channel 4 was excellent as he remained calm in the face of an absurd pseudo-journalist mischaracterizing pretty much everything he said. Oof. It is worth watching if you haven't. And I don't think Dawkins, Pinker, or Neil deGrasse Tyson would have done any better in terms of a public academic intellectual engaging with the world. As for the religious/myth/maps of meaning stuff, people like myths and stories. Peterson is right about that. And his presentation about myths is somewhat like story time itself. There are stories within his meta-story. He's smart, addresses concerns you have, and uses these stories to encourage you to be a better version of yourself. This will be appealing to many. It's even appealing to me. In my opinion, much of what he says seems to be reading into the text to see what he wants to see, with Jungian foundations that have little evidentiary support. But it is blended so well with sentences that really seem to make sense, and they resonate with you, and they're hard to disagree with, that the average person thinks this is amazing.
Yeah.
Whether the structures and myths of religion, as he doesn't literally believe in a Christian God, are a necessity for human civilization seems to be the main debate point. This lurks in the background. I have 5 main concerns. Number 1, Peterson doesn't consistently make the fact-value distinction. Meaning, you can't tell consistently what he means when he uses the word true. My guess is that when Peterson uses the word true, it may mean A, scientifically true, B, something like good for humanity or the world or the evolutionary survival of humanity, or C, some combination of both. In the first interview he had with Sam Harris, which was pretty annoying if you listen to it, they talked about this at length, and Peterson just refused to cave on this. Sam Harris kept saying, well, why don't you use a different word than the word true? Otherwise, everyone's going to be confused. And for him, that was a no-go. And this is maybe such as the nature of pragmatism. Pragmatists typically don't make these distinctions between fact and values. And Peterson has called his version something like Darwinian pragmatism because he's trying to take on board evolutionary theory. But it just seems to be woven in, and I'm not sure if it's that coherent at all. Even worse is when he's discussing scientific claims or meta-analyses, because one cannot help but think he must mean true in the scientific sense. But once you declare you will use true in multiple ways, it is hard to know without checking every time.
Yeah.
Here's another way it plays out. When given a chance to criticize religious fundamentalists, this is on a recent episode of his podcast, he didn't, and he says he can see where they're coming from. Really?
Wow.
You couldn't provide a more balanced response? Peterson's very metaphorical interpretation of Genesis, which he considers literally true in his pragmatist sense, pause to understand that part.
Oh, boy.
It's a metaphor, but the story of Genesis, using its signs and symbols, relates to the nature of existence so deeply, it is classified as true. Okay, it's not that the story is literally true, it's that the meaning it imports to your existence is true. That's very different than thinking the literal interpretation of Genesis is factually true in the scientific sense. And if everyone understood that when he speaks, sure. And I have a feeling very few people do, because he's not consistently clear about it himself. You can try to piece it together. That's the first one. B, he seems to be similarly confident about all his claims as opposed to be proportionate to the likelihood of them being accurate. On the podcast, we often talk about cognitive humility and say, well, I could be wrong. And Peterson does that sometimes, and he does say, I'm just trying to make sense of this. This is what I've worked on for 20 years. And so sometimes he does seem to promote and engage in some sort of humility as well as acknowledging that he doesn't know everything. But generally speaking, when he speaks, he seems so confident. In this way, it is very helpful when there are other like-minded people being interviewed alongside Peterson. They can challenge him, and sometimes he just says, okay, yeah, and backs down or changes his mind almost immediately. Right. Hard to know, though, without that challenge. And I don't mean the unconstructive challenges in the BBC interview. Now, perhaps his views are strongly expressed, but weakly held. A friend of mine made the point, which you can have. Like, okay, I might change my mind quickly because I'm open to new ideas. Yeah. Peter even says someone might know something you don't, but he expresses them so forcefully, it doesn't really seem that way. Hard to say. He is sometimes humble, but it doesn't really seem to be consistent. Third, his broad, interpretive, highly subjective exploration of issues and his belief in the necessity of that approach doesn't work that well for people who want to isolate and evaluate specific claims, like myself or other rationalists or certain people perhaps on the podcast. It is possible that we should take consciousness or experience as the fundamental aspect of reality instead of physical matter, but I don't think he's provided a good metaphysical case for that. And by that I mean, when we think about what the nature of the world is, what exists, that for most rationalist people with a scientific worldview, you think it's something like physical matter. Even if it's quantum foam and something kooky like that, you sort of think there's physical things doing physical things. And Peterson's trying to say, that's a first move, that's a primary move in trying to understand the world, and it's an assumption. And it is, and he's correct. You have to start somewhere. But his assumption is, why not start with the nature of experience? Like the fundamental aspect of existence is experience, or conscious experience, or consciousness, and then have everything else fit to that. Which again, it's an assumption, it could be a first move, but then you kind of have to make the case, which I don't think he has. Fourth, On the gender pronoun issue, he either seems to be wrong or just horrible at communicating his views. My current understanding is that he will refer to one of his trans students by their preferred pronoun, but he doesn't think this should be codified into law because, perhaps, the people who are propagating that view have a worldview, which he might call radical Marxism, that misunderstands the world and negatively impacts it. As such, giving in on this issue would lead to negative outcomes. In this case, he will use the terms he or she if someone says, please call me by that pronoun, but he really dislikes sie or zur, or the other ones he calls made-up pronouns for a variety of reasons, and that is where he seems to draw a big line. My criticism is that in all his fights about these trans issues, I've never seen him once say, look, my views on compelled speech are important, but let's not forget this is a very marginalized group that needs our help and compassion. He typically doesn't say something like that. And he knows, because he's smart, that a lot of the people who support him say a lot of negative things about trans people.
Yeah.
As someone said, if you watch enough Peterson videos, what Google starts to suggest you want to watch is filled with tons of alt-right, lack of progressive stuff.
Yeah. I very briefly tried to follow Peterson to kind of see what he was doing on social media, but it was just the people that surrounded him that were just terrible and toxic, and I just couldn't stand that because he seems to attract a very bad kind of person, which doesn't necessarily mean that's his fault or a reflection on him, but it's still annoying.
As someone said, you can't blame someone for the fans they have, but it is something you might have to think about more deeply. Yeah. And so just to really flesh out the point, and this is where sometimes Peterson doesn't sound like he's maybe as rigorous or consistent in logic as other people might think, if you start to have to use gender pronouns of the type of the made-up type, he's thinking that's something like compelled speech. And to be fair, he might have a case under Ontario human rights legislation and how a couple things have played out with Lindsay Shepherd, but it's not quite clear that it's definitely the case. The idea is compelled speech leads to totalitarian societies, which tips the world towards evil and chaos, which then, like Stalin or Mao, leads to the deaths of tens of millions of people. So it's not that sie and zur themselves lead to hundreds of millions of people dying. But, and I believe this is a sincere belief he has, the ideology that underlies the belief that there should be compelled speech in terms of these pronouns does lead to the death of hundreds of millions of people. So for him, he does draw a connection, sie, zur, millions dying.
It seems like, taken alone, his view on on transgender issues and pronoun issues probably isn't that unusual amongst the general public.
Correct.
But it's just, I guess he's just an intellectual who's really pushing hard on it, and so that sort of gets a big following and gets a big reaction.
Correct. I mean, there's even trans people who agree with him, but I think he is at least providing some sort of intellectual foundation for the view, which is what usually people on the right have less of.
Yeah.
5, he may be fundamentally wrong about the key things driving everything else he does. First, he thinks the 20th century was filled with horror, which it was, but he seems to think it was much worse than anything else. Well, good old Steven Pinker has showed that violence has declined over time, and generally most things have gotten better. Second, Peterson thinks the loss of religion is one of the reasons for all this chaos. That's not at all clear. He does say tribalism is the issue, but religion may actually make people more tribal.
Absolutely.
Third, he believes we need to return to religion to bring back more order. They're the same above. This isn't clear at all. When he says things like casual sex is, quote, not commensurate with the demands of an advanced civilization, it just kind of sounds weird. Now, you could say, well, do you have any data on that one way or another? And then you say, well, maybe certain societies which seem to be more progressive, like the Scandinavian countries that we want to inhabit, are more progressive and they seem to be more tolerant towards sexual attitudes. Well, ones that are more regressive, like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, seem less desirable to live in. But you could debate the point. Anyway, it does pattern match to like, that kind of nuts. Mm-hmm. Further, when it does get to things one can use data to verify, it doesn't sound so great. He talks about the divine hero, which is a huge archetype in his worldview, and he believes in the world. And his huge focus on individualism is really only applicable to men because women, as a concept, are paired with having a child. And if women don't have children, then they just won't be happy. Yeah. Slips that in there.
That's not...
No wonder the right likes him so much.
Yeah.
Now, you could make the case that on average, there are more women who end up being happy if they happen to have kids because the biological urge to have kids is so strong, but I don't think that's true either. And at least he's not making the case, right?
Sure.
Well, he clearly has some thoughts about what a family structure should be. And so I may have listened to him in different venues than you did, Darren. He was on Adam Carolla, he was on H3H3, and he definitely has some thoughts about the structure of the family, about making focuses on keeping the family together. Like it almost has a religious connotation.
Right. And he may have some data, again, true in what sense, because he has a background in clinical psychology, where it shows that people who are in disruptive relationships or this and that, their lives are less good. But that doesn't mean being in a bad marriage is better than being in no marriage. Hard to say.
No, being in a bad marriage is one of the worst mental states to be in.
I would think so.
Susan Pinker's book, The Village Effect, talks a lot about loneliness, and one of the things is like it's bad to be single, and it's great to be married, and it's blah blah blah. Except if you're in a bad marriage, and it's like the worst thing, and it's just terrible for your enjoyment, right?
Right. So those are my general thoughts on Peterson, and now on to 12 Rules for Life, in which you may notice a little overlap with what I just said, but the book is kind of its own thing. My key message is that while parts are interesting or entertaining, I can't recommend the book, but it could have value for the discerning reader. First, you don't need to read the book because most of the interesting parts are already available from his online lectures and podcasts. There really is a lot of information online if you want to watch YouTube videos or listen to his podcast. Yep. Second, because the book tries to be two things, and one of those things has lots of problems. The first thing 12 Rules tries to be is a self-help book, which isn't too bad at all by the standards of that genre. I don't read a lot of them, but I have read a couple. Peterson's background in clinical psychology makes interesting stories and then lessons for the reader or listener. It is also hard to argue with some of the rules. Get your life in order, realize you may not know everything, be more honest in your relationships, take responsibility for your actions, etc. If someone is just giving you rules for living, you are often less concerned with the supporting evidence and more often just thinking if it resonates with you. One of the highlights in the book is his battle to feed his young son. Another was his exploration of the anxiety and chain of chaotic thoughts that occur if you suspect your partner may be cheating on you. Oof. You will always beat a child at something like getting them to eat if you have time and preparation. He's like, if you set aside a couple hours, you can win. Because to a kid, half an hour is like a week. It's just too much time to pass. If the book was kept to such things, it would be hard to take much of an issue with it. It'd probably also be half the length or less. But, and this is my guess, Peterson couldn't resist the opportunity to explicate his more fundamental views. Thus, the second thing the book tries to do is ground his advice in a supposedly deeper, metaphorical interpretation of famous myths and stories from the mostly Western canon. Peterson uses these stories to, in his opinion, validate why you should tell the truth or provide children with limits or be open to the world, because if you don't, then you will drift towards chaos instead of order, and that leads to totalitarianism, which leads to hell. Consequently, if you don't personally try to make your life better, you are turning your back on God or beauty and such things, and then not making the world a better place. There was nowhere near enough rigor or evidence presented in the book to justify Peterson's supreme confidence in these ideas or interpretations. Peterson seems to believe that tales like the Book of Genesis were not meant to be interpreted rationally, because being itself is so profound and difficult to understand that it can't be understood rationally either. His fundamental presupposition, one of his favorite words, seems to be that free will and the ancient dualisms of chaos and order exist, or are the most basic things that can be said to exist, and thus all other dualisms and constraints follow from it.
So he's not a determinist.
I don't think so. I think the scientific worldview makes more sense, which he leans on very heavily when it supports his beliefs, such as in personality psychology, but then doesn't address issues like science heavily indicating there's nothing like a counter-causal free will. Yeah. Of course, presuppositions or fundamental metaphysical worldview stances don't have to be fully justified, but they should at least get a fair treatment so a reader can see why it should be adopted. His knowledge of mythology and confidence aren't enough to convince. Well, they shouldn't be, but many people will probably find that sufficient. Yeah. Thus, my concern about recommending this book to all but the discerning reader. Some of these ideas can easily lead to more societal problems. Perhaps one cannot be as famous as he is without also being a bit infamous. If you listen to Peterson, though, and this is just personal reflection, I do find it entertaining. I find it interesting, and I find it a good way to look at the world and useful, at least for some of the stories. But I can very much see how some people would go too far with it. I also think his foundations may not be that good. Some of his work may be interpreted in a bad way that's bad for the world, but I can also see that it's going to work for some people, and it seems to have improved the lives of thousands of people who are just trying to get their life together. Yeah. If you look at it from a clinical psychology perspective, some people are trying to deal with relatively, we'll say, basic, from our point of view, problems. Can you manage to get a job? Can you manage to feed yourself? Can you manage to open that email and deal with that thing you're not dealing with? Can you address basic issues of emotional problems in your life? And helping people with those things is obviously good, and that seems to be doing a lot of good in terms of what Jordan Peterson has accomplished.
Not that I'm making any parallels. But isn't that similar to what something like a cult leader does?
Well, he is highly aware of his fame and his almost cult-like status, and it very much concerns him, which is another reason you can give him some kudos.
Yeah.
He is very concerned about saying the wrong thing or tipping the wrong balance or causing more chaos. Now, you could say from someone else's perspective, he's already doing the bad thing, but at least from his awareness, he's trying to navigate this weird world. Alternatively, you could say if the alt-right people on the internet, which seem to be unreachable, are now getting some sort of help, that might be a good thing. Because it's nice to pretend that you don't have to live in a world with everyone else, but you do. And if other people who are a bit gone can at least be mildly redeemed, lacking a better expression, that is probably better for the world. That's also hard to say. That's an empirical question.
So, okay, let's sort of frame it this way. Although you think a lot of what he says sort of is unfounded or more or less nonsense, do you think anything he says is dangerous to the point where bringing someone in with some good ideas and some compelling thoughts and then leading them to the other things would really lead to sort of bad things in society or bad behaviors on their part or just being wrong?
That's a good question. So a lot of what he says, I think, is actually right. Mm-hmm. And if you just listen to like a lot of the Channel 4 interview, what he says, I believe, is correct.
Yeah.
Also, most people don't necessarily go as deep as probably I have for a lot of this in terms of their analysis or taking it on. And if what they hear is, oh, try to be more honest in your relationships and be more open-minded, and you're like, well, yeah, that's good. That's going to help out. Even the guy who writes Slate Star Codex says, well, it's a bunch of cliches, but I like them because they worked for me. Because when he says it, it seems like it resonates more. And a lot of that's delivery. If you sound like an old-timey evangelist who's really confident, maybe it seems to work. To what extent other people are taking on board the gender pronoun issue and seem to have regressive views like, yes, women should have babies and the family structure is really important, looking to him as a very capable intellectual, at least speaker, and intelligent man who, yes, if you watch him engage with opponents online, he usually does beat them. Now, do we need videos that say Peterson destroys X, which that's almost all they're all listed. Like, this is not a constructive discussion. This is not how we want the world to be. But that is how the internet is. Yeah. So the concern is, yes, those people are being helped, but then they're also being tipped towards a worldview, which I don't think is necessarily good, but I also think it's not that founded in evidence. Yeah. But then they might think so.
Or are they being brought in because they're finding an intellectual that matches their worldview, and maybe that's bringing them towards something else, right? It's hard. Right. It's hard to see where it's all coming from.
It could be they already had a certain worldview, and he just happens to say it better, so they like it. It could be that they were not doing that well in their life, and then he helped them become better versions of themselves. Yeah, it is pretty difficult to know, but I think it's worth being concerned about, given how much power this person happens to have.
Yeah.
So as I was saying to you, Darren, I've listened to Peterson on a couple of platforms that maybe you haven't, and I don't see him hugely different than like someone like Milo Yiannopoulos or Charles Murray. Ideas that have some basis in fact and some basis in science, and then they kind of take a curve for an agenda in my mind. Do you see him as particularly destructive compared to them?
That's a good question. I don't know enough about Milo. I don't know if he has quite the academic chops compared to Peterson. Charles Murray does, but I see Murray's is more of a researcher, and since I haven't read the bell curve, I can't speak to it, but the interview with Sam Harris did seem to indicate that Murray was relatively cautious in his statements about the data, but then he just got completely flamed for it, which is very different than Peterson overtly saying these things are not good because it leads to chaos and darkness. And Charles Murray has never said anything like that.
Right.
And his language is it's so religious that it can't help but empower people who are religious. And that can be useful in some ways, but I think problematic in others. So when you ask Peterson, well, do you believe in the crucifixion? His response was like, oh, yeah, of course. How could you not? And then he says, aren't we all being crucified? And you're like, okay. So, yeah, you didn't. If you take the first part, it sounds like obviously he's a literal follower of all these things. Yeah. And he doesn't say, by the way, people literally believing in angels is not good. But of course, in his world, angels as an idea to help understand the nature of being might provide value, and therefore it is true. Yeah. And that's also because he seems to also have more popularity and power than either of those two people.
Well, Darren, he doesn't seem to have any really good debate opponents, or at least anyone who wants to step up to the plate to debate him. And I nominate you. I think you would be awesome.
I think you should totally do that, Darren.
Well, thanks. I'm happy to try. Jordan Peterson or your handlers, get in touch with us at trcpodcast.com. And now to explore greater metaphysical presuppositions, Cristina is going to talk to us LeBron James gaining 7 pounds during a basketball game.
As many longtime checkers know, I'm a big NBA fan. Specifically, my beloved Toronto Raptors, who are currently #1 in the Eastern Conference.
Ooh.
So I like to keep up on basketball news and especially enjoy sports articles with a science or critical thinking angle. A few days ago, I came across an article by Dennis Young in Deadspin with a headline that stopped me in my tracks, literally. We asked a sports science expert if LeBron could have really gained 7 pounds during a basketball game. Paint me a skeptic, but the notion of LeBron James, who is a very big man, gaining 7 pounds during an intense playoff game sounds pretty implausible to me.
Agreed.
So what's going on here? So the catalyst for Young's piece was originally an ESPN article from 2 weeks ago about LeBron James' incredible athleticism and ability to avoid career-threatening injuries, which is really well known to basketball fans, whether you love him or you hate him. And there's a lot on either side. So here's an excerpt from that ESPN article from Brian Windhorst for context. Seeing him, LeBron, turn his ankle nearly 90 degrees only to tighten his shoelaces and finish with a triple-double, watching him show up 4 hours before a playoff game to get into a sweat-soaked workout, then play more than 40 minutes and score 40 points, and the topper, the time James gained 7 pounds during an Eastern Conference Finals game. Some Miami Heat teammates saw the scale and attest to it in amazement. James himself just shrugs and calls it weird as hell. The truly wild part is that it was from 271 pounds to 278 pounds, though James is much lighter these days. End quote. So LeBron is back with the Cleveland Cavaliers now, but he was part of the Miami Heat for 4 seasons, I believe, and he helped garner them 2 NBA championships in 2012 and 2013. So Young was skeptical himself after reading the claim. As he says in his article, why would Windhorst, normally a fair and rigorous reporter, include an anecdote like this without exploring the possibility that it didn't really happen? You're a good man, Dennis Young. So Young started by reaching out to Miami Heat spokesman Tim Donovan, who told him, I don't know when this happened, and I asked my guys, and they don't know either. Sorry. So Young turned to an expert in the field, sports science and hydration expert Ross Tucker. There's the magical word, hydration. Spoiler alert, Tucker was equally skeptical. Says Tucker, it's borderline impossible to gain that much mass in a basketball match, even if it's 2 hours start to finish, if you include warm-ups and halftime and so forth. He's had a net gain of 3.5 pounds per hour despite playing, say, 40 minutes of high-intensity basketball. In those 40 minutes, I would expect that he could lose 2 kilograms. Now, there's a study on elite young basketball players showing that their sweat rate was 2.7 liters per hour, which would give you 1.8 liters in 40 minutes of play. In this study, it was hot, 30 degrees Celsius, which is a lot warmer than in an air-conditioned arena. So I think 1.8 to 2 liters of sweat loss is a pretty aggressive estimate. Maybe it's more likely 1.5 liters of total sweat loss. Anyway, it would mean that he'd had to drink or eat about 8 to 9 pounds worth of fluid or food to end up 7 pounds heavier after the game. No way, not a chance. Okay, so something I didn't know until reading Tucker's reply is that it is actually possible to gain weight during marathons, for instance, because they take so long and runners are really hyper aware of the dangers of dehydration. So they develop these fail-safe strategies to try and drink as much as they sweat. Some studies suggest your body needs 40 ounces of fluid per hour during an average sweat rate. But as Tucker says, the problem is that most of the people following this advice are nowhere near that kind of sweat loss. We're talking slower runners with sweat rates of maybe 20 to 30 ounces per hour. So if they're following this 40 ounce per hour rule and only losing 30 ounces of sweat, then they may end up 10 fluid ounces heavier, or about 300 grams per hour.
So these are like average Joes who like think they're at the top elite level, so they're hydrating the amount that they would expect to lose, but they're really not.
Yeah, so if you're running a marathon in 5 hours, it is possible you're finishing at 1.5 kilograms, or just over 3 pounds heavier than when you began. which I thought was pretty fascinating. Now, there's a flip side. There's a danger with over-consuming fluids. I'm sure you guys have heard about this. It's called hyponatremia. It occurs when overconsumption of fluids dilute the salt levels in your body, and this can lead to some serious health consequences, including death. And I heard a couple of stories of marathon runners in a Boston Marathon, I believe, that were affected by this. So, even so, we know a lot of people overdrink during marathons, but not all develop hyponatremia. So there may be a few who unfortunately retain fluid rather than excrete it. But for the most part, our bodies are smart enough to know when it needs to get rid of too much water. So back to LeBron. Is there any likely scenario where he could have possibly gained 7 pounds after one game? It's unlikely that he changed his usual pre-game routine. But as Tucker says, even if LeBron overhydrated during a game where he barely played, it's still implausible. The least amount of time he played during a Heat playoff game in the Eastern Conference was 24 minutes and 21 seconds during Game 5 in 2014 when he was in foul trouble. And I guarantee he was going really hard those 24 minutes that he was on the court.
So not only would he had to been drinking a lot of water, but he would have had to been sitting on the bench eating an entire roast beef, right?
Okay. It may be possible if LeBron weighed himself after a game in full gear and all of his padding and it absorbed a significant amount of sweat, it might tip the scale. But 7 pounds, that's a huge stretch. So if we're to dig into our critical thinking toolbox and apply Occam's razor here, simplest and most likely explanation is faulty measuring equipment, like a scale that was not properly calibrated, or he was on one scale, then another. So there you
Another
have it.
player is putting his toe on those scales from behind, and no one ever caught it. And it was funny, and it's so epic because it ended up in the news. You remember the time, guys?
And they're all making fun of him behind his back. Yeah. Now, something really interesting, guys, that I had to look up because it occurred to me when I was reading this. Can you actually eat an 8-pound sandwich and gain 8 pounds from that? And the really interesting answer to that is yes.
Wow.
A nutritionist with the New York Obesity Research Center, Carla Walper, and this is at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital Center. She says if you ate a pound of anything and stepped on the scale immediately, you would weigh a pound more.
Of course.
But the digestive enzymes begin immediately, so that doesn't last too long.
So if I'm standing on the scale and I have a sandwich in my hand,
It'll be constant.
It won't change.
Correct.
Until I sweat, because it was sweating my clothes, but I would have to
until you excrete it
pee
out
or something, right?
Anyways, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cristina. I do think we're overlooking one possibility, of course, is that there's a different gravitational fluctuation before and after the game. Because as you notice, the hydration expert said mass, but we're talking about weight. So, obviously, it's clear that's what happened.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we're going to get a comment from Stuart Robbins on that one.
And thanks for joining us once again. Adam explored Cadbury's secret war on Easter, but really just give them a break. They're so busy. I gave you tons of information about Jordan Peterson, my thoughts on him. Generally speaking, he could be good or bad, depending on which subset of things you experience with him and or your worldview. Cristina looked into the claim of whether LeBron James gained 7 pounds during a game, and the conclusion is that's pretty preposterous. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.
Outtakes. You don't like Jordan Peterson? It's fine. It's fine. Don't use mine. It's fine.
Wow. Everyone's a cricket.
Darren.
Yep. Too fast?
Slow down. Yeah. I literally leaned into my mic for about 45 seconds now, waiting for a breath to say something.
Pat, just edit the sound between the words.
And finally, Christine looked into whether LeBron James gains...
Christine.
Sorry.
Who's Christine?
Oh,
Who's
I didn't
Christine
even
Darren?
hear say Christine.